Welcome to the Jones Zone, a podcast by Darryl and JJ Jones.
You that have not subscribed yet, please click on that subscribe button. It'll help get this video out to more and more people. I think this is always interesting for people. Do you recall what's the highest price appraisal you've ever done?
Of recent, I think it was 52.4 million was the highest I think I've done. It was the largest sale in that market, and it actually was a sale where they had bought the surrounding lots. So the estate itself was sitting on about 12 and a half acres.
That's interesting. My brother-in-law and sister-in-law live in La Cañada, right above the Rose Bowl.
Oh, sure.
And they or right next to them, there was a lot that had been vacant lot for decades. And finally, a sign popped up there. My brother-in-law, Mark, calls me, says, Darryl, I want to find out about this lot. There's a sign for sale sign. I call, there's an attorney handling it, which is interesting and unique. So the attorney says, hey, we're having an auction sale. The auction price is 700, I think it's 700 or 750. And he said, you got to come down Saturday, sign in. My brother-in-law and I went down there, and 8 other buyers, as I recall. And so there are 9 people. They start off at 700, 750. You know how an auction goes. It gets all the way up to the nines. And then all of a sudden, all the buyers dropped off except for 2 buyers. 2 buyers just went back and forth, bidded that thing all the way up to $2 million. It was
surprised me.
Yeah, it was such an interesting observation of human nature and a host of other things. So, I mean,
I can tell you, hopefully they did their research, because a big issue of that market is infrastructure, whether it has sewer. A lot of it was on septic for years, and now the city and county is requiring a sewer line to be put in, and that can be so expensive, because we're talking lots that are sometimes an acre. So you're talking about running drainage or a sewer system 1,000 feet or 1,200 feet. I mean, it can be really, really expensive. That's been a major issue in that market for a long time. It just, if you're north of Foothill, usually you're on septic, and then they're kind of pushing a lot of those folks too.
Yeah, and then depending on where the connection is to the public sewer system, I mean, it could be. Yeah, that happened locally to us, where it was a consideration. And I think it was a couple $100,000 in order to do that.
They just say, hey, guess what? We're going to put a bond on this, and you're paying this, and we'll give you 10 years, 20 years to pay it off. And I have a good agent, Don Knapp, that I do a lot of work for, and he kind of got into this where he fought with the county, and the county said, guess what, Don, you owe us $180,000 for your sewer hookup, and it's going to be a bond, and we expect it paid off in 10 years. And, what choice did he have?
Hey, let's talk about this, because this, even though this isn't really happening an enormous amount at the current moment, but it's happened in the past. If someone wants to rebut an appraisal, what's the best thing for them to do? I mean, not yours, of course, because yours are always spot on.
No, I get some rebuts too. I take it very seriously. There's a process for that and a form. I do these, Darryl, for a lot of my clients. They're like, Tom, this doesn't make sense to me, and we're just not seeing this. Can you look at it? And a lot of times I'll either rebut or what I try to offer them.
So bring it to another appraiser.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so that's what they could do.
I can tell you in about 5 minutes whether it's an appraisal of quality or a piece of junk.
That would be the first step, is to get, okay, you're thinking, okay, you're refinancing, you're buying, and you're thinking, hey, that appraisal is too low. First thing is contact another appraiser, have them review that appraisal. Now, is there a charge? I mean, because time is money. Is there typically a fee for that, or does it just?
I usually don't. And what I usually do in those cases is I try to talk the client into just to doing another appraisal at that time, if we can submit another appraisal. I mean, sadly, like for FHA, you're locked into that appraisal. Yeah. So then you would have to
you're locked in for like 6 months. So that's another unknown factor.
Yeah, if you are.
Get an FHA appraisal on a house, you're in escrow, you get an FHA appraisal done. And then for whatever reason, the buyer doesn't get the house and it falls out of escrow, you resell it to another person on an FHA loan. You have to use that same appraisal value. So anyway, just some information for both FHA, our listeners.
Yeah, and it's, I don't know. I did one recently where I was asked to do a rebuttal on an FHA purchase, and the appraiser came in like $15,000 off a $1.3 million purchase, and I'm like, wow, that his crystal ball is pretty well tuned,
Wow. Yeah.
And I didn't see a problem with bringing it in resubmitted, but they were kind of locked in. And sadly, on that, because they're doing a 98%, 2% down, that 15,000 may be, whether the purchase goes through or not, because the buyer may not have that to put in, for the purchase. Things like that do happen. That one kind of upset me because I just felt like this was a bank appraiser and looking for the path of least resistance, where he knew he could kill a deal by just bringing it in a little under the purchase price, and that's exactly what he did. I mean, those things sadly sometimes happen. Most of the time when I get a review, if I can see kind of how the appraisal was put together, and if it makes sense to me, I'm fine with it. But there are times that I feel maybe that appraiser was just too conservative. Maybe he didn't weigh on pending or sales within the market or confirm pending sales.
So I want to maybe delve into just certain aspects on home values, because I know, how do busy streets affect you? Is there a number on that? Or that too, of course, is somewhat, well, I don't know if it's subjective. It depends on how busy a street is.
It's funny. I used to have a little appraisal class I taught, and people would ask that question. I would write on the board, from the market, and that's exactly what it is if you have something on a busy street, you better believe I'm using one or two comparables that are similar. Hopefully they're on the same busy street, or they're on a similar, like, feeder street. Maybe it's a 4-lane feeder. And then I'm comparing, but I'm always pulling that data from the market. Now, I can say this, that, I do a lot of units and income properties where being on a busy street isn't that problematic for an income property where it would be for a single family home. We may not do a big adjustment, but I'm always letting the data kind of speak for itself and do the adjustment according to the data. Any kind of adjustment is a path to make a credible adjustment. Let's say that I'm noticing, like, on a busy street, oh yeah, these have they sell for 80,000 less or 100,000 less. That would be the adjustment I would probably try to make. And I would try to say, look, comps 1 and 2 are on the same busy street. They sold for 580, and then the ones on the track, non-feeders, sold for 630. And that's kind of how we derive the adjustment. Is I always try to kind of let the data speak for how I do the adjustment.
Income property. When you say income property, typically like a fourplex or duplex, and things like that.
As a residential appraisal. Yeah, we can appraise up to 4 units, of course, and I do a lot of unit property.
Correct me if I'm wrong, or at least let our audience know. That'll rely oftentimes on how much rent they're getting.
A huge part of it is not. So there's 3 approaches. So that's by the way, the forms. We didn't really touch on this, but a single family home is done on a 1004 form, and then a condo is the 1073, and then a unit property is a 1025 form. That's the form we use, and on that form, we actually focus more on the income side, how much the property will generate, and what the cap rates are. How much is your loan going to be, what that interest rate is, and we kind of factor all that in to see, how.
Explain to our audience the cap rate, if you don't mind. A cap rate.
Well, it's okay.
I asked you because I can't explain it.
In general terms, it's trying to kind of quantify something that's almost unquantifiable, but you boil down and you come up with a score of how much rent you're considering to how much the mortgage is going to be, and all the expenses tied in. So
your profit.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess it more boils down to, this is what it's going to cost to own the home, and this is what we're going to generate in rent. And then we look at those 2 numbers. And sadly, because of interest rates being so high now, cap rates are not looking good. And banks really look at cap rates. Hey, if we're lending to this guy and it's not producing money, or it's in the red every month, we don't want the loan, and that's kind of what's happening. Is income properties have really, with conventional lending, have really tightened up. We'll see that change, obviously, when rates do come down again. But it's not making them as advantageous to income buyers too, because they're just not seeing a path to making money.
I just met with a future client, and he's got some income property. He was talking about how he says, I learned this from my father. I charge kind of a low rent because I want them to be occupied the entire time. I don't want to have to re-rent it and recarpet it and repaint it and all that stuff. So I charge,
Right.
and he's actually going to be selling. It's out of state. And I said, yeah, oftentimes, and I wanted to ask you this on appraisals. So let's say someone is undercharging people. Let's say they're charging $2,500 rent for a property for a fourplex, let's call it. And the actual, really, if he was to market out, or he or she was to put that on the market now, would probably be able to get $3,500
Right.
a month.
Absolutely.
So you factor that in there, and you just use.
Yeah, we do look at so we give them two numbers on that. We give them what the actual rents are, of course, and then we give them the market rent. What we feel that if the property was vacant and they could lease it with a new tenant, what they would receive. So there's two numbers there. Now I'm an advocate of, I think I've told you this. I own the property across the street, and I haven't raised him in 5 years because he's a great renter. He doesn't cause me any problems, So I'm a very big advocate of, if you have somebody paying you on time, that's not an issue. Don't mess with it.
Oh, I couldn't agree more.
Sadly, I do a lot of trust work where actually did my tax guys. He worked for a company, and sadly the owner passed and owned about 20 properties, and she had never raised her rent in 30 years. So now we're talking properties, single family homes in Anaheim that were going for $850 a month, where market rents were like $5,000 or $5,500. So sometimes, yeah, we can see a huge disparity to what actual rents are as opposed to what market rents are. Yeah, it does happen.
So basically, when it comes to income property, you're going to factor in a lot of what the rents are and what the cap rates are. You said there's 3 or 4 different ways. What were you?
Yeah, there's a cost approach. So when we do income property, those are the ones, and they're very challenging. I mean, by the way, I spend 10 hours. That's a good one. I might spend as much as 25 or 30 hours just doing an income property. They take a lot because you're doing the 3 approaches. You're also looking at cost. Well, what would it cost to build, and can it be rebuilt? All that, plays into it also. The banks kind of want to see the 3 numbers, and do they all jive, and is it permittable? Oh man, I can't tell you how many times, oh yeah, it's supposed to be a fourplex. I get there and there's 12 tenants, because they've subdivided it out. And yeah, so we have to kind of speak to what's legal, what they should be doing, And,
so the 3 approaches: cost approach,
yeah,
comps.
There's a cost, income, and then of course the sales comparable approach, on what similar units are selling for within the market, right? And then they weigh all of that. Now, hopefully those numbers are kind of jived together, but they don't often do. We have rent controlled areas where I have to use rent controlled comparables. Those comparables may be much lower on rents than what the non-rent controlled areas are. Usually, by the way, it's pre-78. If you have a property built prior to 78, it's going to be rent controlled in a lot of areas. And yeah, and then of course the newer stuff would not be rent controlled, and that would allow them to obviously charge a higher rent.
So I sent you that article about how the appraisal industry is changing. And gosh, heck, you probably could have written the article, frankly. Tell us how the appraisal process is changing and appears to be changing.
It is. I mean, I mentioned, I got into this business 23 years ago. We had a 1004 form, and that form was a typewritten form prior to computing. That really hasn't changed much. There are going to be some big changes coming to kind of how we do the work and what forms we use. I can say this, Darryl, we've heard this for a long time from the Appraisal Foundation and USPAP. Hey, we're going to do all these changes. And then the big banks kind of push back and say, well, gee, if you do all these changes, it's going to cost us X amount of dollars, because we have the process set up for this. So I'm hoping, because I do think that we need changes on how the form, the forms are almost comical on how they're put together. There's like a half a line saying, please describe in detail the home. And you get a line, and then they're like, oh, please list the square footage of the home, and you get 6 lines to put in 5 characters. Yeah, none of it really has made a lot of sense for a long time. That's going to change things, and
You think AI is going to come into play at any event?
It does. I mean, a lot of banks use what's called a automated value matrix. They use basically Zillow. By the way, not everything on lending now gets appraised. I mean, if the loan to values LTVs reach a certain threshold, they usually will just do a computer generated or AI generated appraisal. Now, sadly, a lot of times they charge the poor borrower $600, $700, something they get for 60 cents. So
Wow.
yeah, a little bit problematic. I always tell people, look at what you're paying. If you have issues, talk to the lender. It's amazing. People will do all this research to buy a car, but yet they won't look at the process when they're purchasing a home, the biggest purchase they're ever going to make in their life.
Tom, this has been so helpful. And if you could, for any of our listeners who'd like to employ you to do an appraisal on their property for whether it's a trust or whatever, what's the best way to reach you?
Tom Blumberg. I'm on the ORE website, Office of Real Estate Appraisal website. You can just pull up appraisers from there. My email is my name, tom.blumberg@gmail.com.
Blumberg, Blumberg.
Correct. For years, I've always offered to agents, hey, I will come in and do a little appraisal. I used to do tape offs only, but then my insurance said, no, you got to do full appraisal. You're not really covered under insurance. And so now what I offer them is a little bit discounted full appraisal with a tape off if the living space is kind of under dispute.
Explain a tape off. That's just coming out and measuring the house's square footage.
Yeah, physically measuring a property. Yeah. And you probably know as well as I do, it's one of the number one reasons agents get sued is misrepresenting or not having accurate square footage, when they go to list,
Which is interesting because I remember back when I took this is 35 years ago, but there are different ways you can measure a house. So for example, you can measure or maybe this has changed, the exterior of the house and do your geometry.
Appraisers always measure, Darryl, from exterior. And by the way, exterior usually tapes out a little bit bigger, because you are using those exterior measurements. They have tightened up measurement standards. We used to kind of round to every half a foot, and now we round to the inch, so because it's become a bigger issue now, with the prices being what they are per square foot. I'm an old school guy. I still like to physically tape something and I put it on graph paper and I do all that stuff because I don't want mistakes, because that's the one thing that a borrower or a buyer can look at. Let's say you make a mistake, you better believe they're going to be out there with a tape measure checking your work, so I always try to make sure that is absolutely spot on accurate, and it can be an issue, obviously, when you go to sell. Usually what happens is you'll have somebody buy a home and they're like saying, oh, geez, it was 2,000 square feet. And then they go to sell the home and then they find out it was 1,800 or something.
Well, of course, it shrinks.
Yeah,
I'm kidding.
Exactly. Yeah. And then, obviously, if there's a discrepancy in the public record to what it actually is, and then you have to explain, whether additions to the home, were they permitted, are they allowable? I mean, these things are huge on, selling a home.
On that note, is it fair to say that, let's say, an unpermitted enclosed patio, because typically you don't count unpermitted work. Is that true? And
no,
also,
not necessarily.
Doesn't add value. Okay.
Yeah, I always tell people, I do a lot of work in like Santa Ana, and I always say you can't swing a dead cat without hitting an unpermitted something.
Yeah.
You can't, because there's so much non-permitted. So what we kind of do on that is, I won't give it credit as living space, but I'll use comparables that have similar. Let's say they have an enclosed patio, and I'll try to use other comparables with those same, this is not permitted, but this one here is not permitted also. And I will talk about, whether it's permitted and I mean, so
it could add some value.
Yeah, it does. You usually, again, it falls back on workmanship quality. I mean, we're looking at it, is it workmanship okay? Is the quality of construction okay? Is this something that they maybe could seek out, a permit for? And those actually would most of the time add value.
All right. Well, this has been fantastic, Tom. Please, everybody, contact Tom if you did want an appraisal, because he's obviously knows his stuff, or you had any questions. And I'm just so grateful for you joining us here on the Jones Zone. And thank you for joining us. Have a great day. Thank you again for doing this. Reach out to Tom if you guys have questions.
Thank you, Darryl.
Take care now.
Yes.
All right.
And if you need a good agent, there's your man right there.
Oh, goodness. Thank you. Those of you that have not subscribed yet, please click on that subscribe button. It'll help get this video out to more and more people.